Leave. Now. Come no closer. No closer, I say. The madness wears.
In a buried corner of the Land of Shadow, in a ravine that has been stricken from all histories, the abyssal woods lie forgotten, untouched even by sunlight. Also known as the Sanctum of Sage Midra, it is a region forbidden by the Hornsent, and for good reason, for it has been all but consumed by the flame of frenzy. The yellow chaos fire that spreads like an infection, melting away all that divides and distinguishes. The flame's presence in the woods is unmistakable. It burns in the eyes of the local wildlife, from the tumbling sheep to the giant rats, and insects like the loathsome winter lanternflies. The frenzy afflicts even the plant life, causing it to grow yellow and bloom with sickly growths. It saturates the very land, rock and river alike cut through with glowing xanthous streaks. The worst horror of the woods are the aged, bent humanoids who in place of heads bear sagging sprigs of bulging grapes. The spiraling canes they support themselves with suggest a relation to the elderly sages of the nearby tower folk. An intangible shield around them wards away harm, the source of their name, aging untouchables. The mere gaze of an untouchable infects others with frenzy, making them terrifying propagators of the yellow flame. But the woods were not always like this. Hard as it may be to believe, this blighted realm of madness was once green in all directions, flowering with meadow sage and grass lilies bathed in rich sunlight. The ravine full of bird song and the buzzing of bees, the local sheep flattening the grass as they tumbled in small herds. How could this peaceful scene be so thoroughly corrupted? This is what we will seek to answer today, as we delve into the lies of the Three Fingers, the brutality of the Hornsent Inquisition, and the unspeakable horrors that took place in Midra's manse. We will start at the beginning, with the sage and the lady who built a home and tried to start a family. Part 1. Sage Midra and Lady Nanaya. Though the grand home of Sage Midra and his lady Nanaya has fallen to ruin, its crumbling bones still speak to its history. It is built and decorated using the sensibilities of the Hornsent, also called the Tower Folk. Comparing the manse to the nearby Tower Folk settlement of Bellarat, the similarities in architecture and aesthetics are numerous. Spiral columns, carvings of helical trees, ceiling hangings and wall banners of ochre fabric, bas-reliefs of clerics or sages, hanging incense burners, even identical oil lamps. Indeed, it seems likely that Nanaya herself was of the Tower Folk. Though her head is covered, preventing us from seeing if she has horns, the style and decoration of her home both point towards a Hornsent influence in the couple, and Nanaya seems a more likely candidate than the obviously hornless Midra, for Nanaya is also adorned fully in Hornsent clothing. When comparing her to the Hornsent Grandam who resides in Bellarat, we can see many similarities, including comparable head wraps and shawls, clothing bordered with intricate designs, and tassels hanging from buttons around the head. As for Great Midra, he is likely foreign to the Hornsent lands. Most obviously testified to by his lack of horns, his accent also does not match the local brogue. Perhaps the brooch he wears on his robe, which also appears on painting frames throughout the house, is a clue as to his homeland. Regardless, when he and Nanaya fell in love, and moved into the forested ravine that would become their sanctum, he and she built a home that reflected both of them equally. Her beloved culture was prominently displayed in the house, and his love for knowledge was manifested just as much, as practically every spare wall hosted a bookshelf housing his incomparable collection of tomes. On the second floor, Sage Midra practiced alchemy, and his work tables can still be seen there, covered in dusty vials, crucibles, cauldrons, and old ingredients. The sage and the lady built their life together. They were loved by their servants, who considered Midra a great man. Midra spent his days reading his books or teaching seminars in his classroom, and his manse came to be a magnet for scholars and other erudite folk. They would gather in Midra's spacious discussion chamber and share new discoveries or debate matters of theory. These discussion sessions were where Midra first gained an interest in the stone fingers that grew in the surrounding lands, learning from visiting colleagues who were determined students of the finger ruins. The couple had chosen their home's secluded spot, not just for privacy at a comfortable remove from Nanaya's zealous kin, who looked with suspicion on Midra's devotion to books, but as a place to raise their family, envisioning young tykes running through the ravine's brooks and tall grass. They had known from their earliest days that they wished for children, but this gift had stubbornly eluded them for years. When Nanaya finally did become pregnant, the pair were so overjoyed that they commissioned a portrait of themselves to celebrate the moment, Nanaya's hand gently resting over her womb. Tragically, the child passed on too soon, perhaps born a tangle-horn bairn, a condition described by the horned bairn doll. Tangled horns are a symbol of spirituality, but most young born bearing the oversized horns meet a frightfully early demise. As soon as their prayed-for child arrived, it was gone. The dreams of Nanaya and Midra dissolved in an instant, and they sank into the deepest pits of sorrow. Part 2. The First Flickers of Frenzy. Midra and Nanaya were racked with intolerable grief, and they found themselves unwilling to accept that their child was truly gone. With Nanaya's support, Midra delved into his books, searching for a solution, a way to bring his child back from the dead. In time, he came across references to a mysterious yellow flame. The shaky hand of one author wrote that the flame provided a way for things which were separated to be reunited again, for unity to arise from division, even to melt away the very border between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. The author babbled about some metaphysical concept he called the One Great, a state where all things once existed without division, and he claimed the yellow flame of frenzy would undo the primordial fracturing that had first split the world. Indeed, the author seemed somewhat mad, but Midra was desperate, and if there was any chance at all that this frenzied flame could really pierce the border of the spirit world and reunite his family, then Midra would pursue it. Midra set out to track down this yellow fire, and in a faded history book, he read that in a distant land, in an age long past, was born a man who failed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Incredibly, the book claimed that the remains of this failed lord still existed, preserved as a dying ember locked in some ancient tomb. Midra dispatched agents to retrieve this yellow ember from its distant home, and it was successfully brought back to the manse. Midra and Nanaya tentatively attached the feeble ball of fire to all that remained of their lost offspring, a small spinal column painfully twisted by the poor child's tanglehorn affliction. Desperate to be reunited, the couple naively hoped that this fusion would somehow connect their child's remains with the fire that was supposed to melt division, that with this torch they could light the dark paths of the spirit world and guide their kin back to them. But it was not enough. Nanaya devoted herself to the torch, cradling it day and night, whispering the loving words of a mother into the fire, praying that they would reach her beloved child. Midra, meanwhile, refused to accept that his knowledge and learning could fail him. His course was unaltered. If his child was lost in the One Great, then there must be a way to reach inside and pull them back. All that Midra needed was to learn the method. Part 3. The Three Fingers. The sage became obsessed. He searched day and night, bending over yellowed pages until the words blurred in his vision and his bent back ached. He locked himself in his study for days at a time, his loyal servants begging him to eat and drink lest he wither away. Until, finally, he found it. In a dusty tome so old its pages disintegrated at the lightest touch. A reference to the Three Fingers, supposed to be the very emissary of the flame of frenzy. If the knowledge that Midra sought existed, surely this entity could impart it to him. Midra needed to know more about fingers, and he knew exactly where to begin his search for such lore. His manse was near the great finger ruins of Raya and Deo, and his discussion chamber had many times hosted finger weavers, somewhat unsettling scholars who made their specialty those strange stone formations infested with lampreys and finger creepers. Midra collected relics from the ruins, stone fingers and cracked spheres, hiding them away in a secret room. By studying the relics, Midra and his accomplices devised a method to summon the Three Fingers to his discussion chamber. The evidence of the fingers' dark presence remains. Fingerprint burns, seared into the wooden floor. The room that had once hosted debates and symposiums with academics and literators now hosted discussions with the Three Fingers, the physical incarnation of the frenzied flame. In fact, the fingerprint markings left on the ground may be a transcript of these discussions, for the readerless fingers relayed their message through these imprints, said to be the very seeds from which frenzy first sprouted. Without the knowledge to read such prints, one could only guess at what was said. Midra, however, had with him the finger weavers, and they served as interpreters for the sage. Midra begged the fingers to tell him how he and his lady might be reunited with their lost child. The fingers answered, telling Midra that his child did indeed still exist, lost in the flame of chaos. Midra could have what he wanted, but only if he gained power over the yellow fire, if he succeeded where the feeble lord had failed. He would have to become the lord of frenzied flame. Then, he would have enough control over the yellow fire to make his family one, to reach into the mad vortex and pull his child back whole. But how could Midra assume the title of lord? How could he make himself strong enough to host the flame without succumbing to it? He knew well enough from his studies what the chaos flame did to the weak, how it burned their eyes and reduced them to howling madness. This was not a fate he desired for himself. The answer was simple, the Three Fingers replied. If they could but tenderly grasp some of Midra's colleagues, the fingers could turn them into vessels of its power, guides that could gently shepherd Midra into the full strength of his destined lordship, slowly building his weak form into that of a true lord. Midra did not force anybody to be grasped by the fingers, for even until the very end, those in Midra's household thought of him as a great man, not one who would sacrifice others for his own ends. No. There were present in the room that day those who would willingly hurl themselves into the unknowns of such a fate. The finger weavers. Those whose minds had been all but shattered by their brush with the sublime truths they perceived in the finger ruins. Obsessed with fingers as they were, of course they would let themselves be taken in the Three Fingers' grasp. The 6 finger weavers present rushed forward, each desperate to be first for the honor. And thus were the 6 aging untouchables born, each finger weaver's head swelling like a sprig of ripe grapes, and in their painful ecstasy they touched the words of the 3 fingers, and this is what they were commanded. Gift your madness to our Lord. Bless our brethren with grapes. Take care that they fully ripen. In time, their grapes did ripen, and the swollen eyeballs that grew on the untouchables testify to their origin, for those grapes are marked with fingerprint burns, proof of having been touched directly by the 3 fingers' embrace. They did as they were instructed, gifting their madness to their lord, Sage Midra. Midra forced himself to swallow their swollen grapes, kindling the yellow flame to take root in his belly. Midra kept the aging untouchables imprisoned in the discussion chamber, treating them like animals, spreading straw across the ground to absorb their waste. Midra feared that they might spread their madness to others if let loose. He alone must eat of the grapes. He alone must imbibe the fire. He warned his servants to stay away from the chamber, telling them, "Approach not the madness, lest ye succumb." It seems, however, that this isolation was not foolproof. A torn diary page in the manse suggests that somebody ventured too close to the madness. Perhaps an overeager servant entered the discussion chamber to bring food or a message to Midra, only to be accosted by one of the erstwhile fingerweavers. After the encounter, the servant wrote in their diary in a tremulous hand, the blight already rooting into their brain. "I touched him, but only once. When he thrust his staff in my face, I brushed it aside. It was then that I touched him. The aging, untouchable." In the ruins of the manse today, the shadow undead who linger on are mostly unafflicted by the yellow flame, but a few hold its sparks behind their eyes. Perhaps a frightened member of the house staff saw these slip-ups, these worrying signs that the frenzied flame would inevitably spread, and secretly informed on their master Midra, reporting what was happening in the house to the infamous horn-sent Inquisition. Back in the manse, and oblivious to the zealots who were now learning of their deeds, Midra and Nanaya tenderly stoked the flame that grew inside the old sage. Their dreams were soon to be realized. Once Midra became a true lord, they would be with their child again. Then hell came to the manse, and madness truly erupted. Part 4. The Inquisition. There is no greater sin among the Hornsent than meddling with the frenzied flame. Spirits are eternal, and yet frenzied flame melts them away regardless. No wonder the Hornsent forbid the flame's use. When the Hornsent Inquisitors learned of Midra's actions, that he was not only using the flame of frenzy, but that he had physically summoned the nightmarish 3 fingers themselves, it was a crime far beyond any ordinary heresy. A cohort of Inquisitors led by Elder Inquisitor Jory breached the sanctum of Sage Midra, intent on divinely punishing those inside. When they reached the manse, Inquisitor Jory strode through the front door, where she was greeted by Midra's butler, who warned the Elder Inquisitor of the danger in the house and Master Midra's dictate, saying, "I welcome you, O uninvited guest, but must I warn, as you venture in, heed the words of our great Master Midra. Approach not the madness, lest ye succumb." Jory did not take heed. and she unleashed unrivaled cruelty on the manse, instructing her inquisitors to carefully inflict on the residents a torture so painful as to match the cardinal sin the household had committed. The Hornsent Inquisition is famous for its use of torture, but Inquisitor Jory in particular made it an art form, even designing her staff to emphasize this preference for pain. Great Staff of Jory, Elder Inquisitor. The tip bristles with golden barbs, symbolic of the Inquisition's torture. The Inquisitors wasted no time. They smashed apart the home that Midra and Nanaya had so lovingly built, ripping the books from their shelves and throwing them in piles to be burnt, destroying one of the greatest libraries in all lands. But this was merely rote procedure. As Inquisitors under the command of the sadistic Jory, their true passion was torture, and they agonized the manse's residents with the golden barbs and hexes of their order, killing them slowly and painfully. For the sages who had assisted Midra in his heresy, they had a special punishment. They dragged each one, hands bound, out in front of the manse, and decapitated them one after another. Into each neck stump they thrust a golden barb, a signature of the Inquisition, and a warning that a similar fate would come to all who followed the example of the manse. One of the only survivors of this violence crafted a foul weapon that gives insight into the slaughter. A glove, stitched together from the flayed skin of the victims of a butcherous bloodbath, forged of an unyielding, black impulse toward revenge fostered in those who were hunted down as heretics by their own brethren. These are the weapons of the utterly downtrodden. This description echoes the words of a Hornsent servant whose agonized spirit still lingers in the manse, lamenting his torture at the hands of the Inquisitors, crying out, "I beg you, stop. Haven't I taken enough? Are we not brethren, common in our line? And yet you offer only cruelty. I ask, what crime did great Midra commit?" The words of this servant reveal that the woods around the manse were, at that moment, apparently yet uncorrupted by madness. For if the woods had already been overrun by frenzy, the effects of Midra's actions would be readily apparent, and it would be inexplicable for this servant to not understand Midra's crime. Ironically, it seems then that the Inquisitors themselves must have unleashed the madness. As they ripped through the manse, slaughtering its denizens and burning its heretical books, they barged recklessly into the discussion chamber, finding the monstrosities inside. Attacking them, they found their tower hexes to be useless against the aging untouchables, only provoking them into a frenzied rage. The maddened things fought back, latching onto Inquisitor and house servant alike, swelling their grapes in a terrifying fashion and blaring screeching madness into their victims. A group of Inquisitors took shelter in the west wing of the manse, sealing its doors and protecting themselves inside. Jory led the rest of the cohort from the house, fleeing the forest. Some Inquisitors were taken by madness on the path, and they still walk the abyssal woods today, the yellow flame burning in their eyes. When Jory reported the colossal failure of her mission, she was punished to forever abide with her disgrace. Knowing the aged untouchables could not be harmed, the Hornsent quarantined the sanctum of Sage Midra and stationed Jory as a sentinel to keep interlopers from venturing into the Forbidden Land and rousing the horrors within. They left stone tablets on the ground that marked the border of the woods, urging people to turn back while you are yet able. But what of Midra and Nanaya and the Inquisitors sheltered in the West Wing? When all had quieted in the manse, when the aging untouchables had wandered off into the woods, and all the mad screaming had stopped, the Inquisitors held Midra as their captive, Hating the Sage, the Inquisitors executed the worst form of torture that had ever been employed by their order. A damnation like no other. They thrust a barbed spear down Midra's skull and erupted the implement's thorns, piercing him from his head and ribcage. They consigned Midra to torment on this golden crux, an eternal punishment for his unforgivable crimes. They occasionally stitched up the wounds that the thorns tore in his flesh. Not out of sympathy, of course, only so that his body would not entirely fall to pieces around the barbs, and grant the Sage an early end to his penance. And they left him there, in the discussion chamber, to suffer forever under their watchful eyes. Part 5. Midra, the hero. But we must return to the moments before the Inquisitors arrived at the manse, when the home was yet untouched by violence. The swollen grapes Midra had devoured had taken root in his body and flowered with burning yellow. Midra could feel it, the worm-like writhing that plagued the back of his eyes, the madness welling in him, spreading to his brain and heart. Midra had inherited the flame of frenzy, and with it, a madness had slithered into his mind, threatening to take away his very sanity. And a terrible realization came to Midra, but far too late. The Three Fingers had lied to him. Becoming the Lord of Frenzied Flame would not give him control over the fire. There is no controlling the fire. The Lord was nothing more than proper kindling. He would be reunited with his child, but only as flames. Their family would not be together, not in any meaningful sense. They would be melted into the one great. No teaching his child to read. No morning strolls through their flowering sanctum. Midra, Nanaya, their child. The life he had always dreamed of, valued even more than his life of books and potions. Midra realized that this life was never to be. And in his grief, he had willingly embraced a fire that threatened to burn away his own wife, burn away even the brief memories of their child, burn away the world entire. When the flame of frenzy inhabits a vessel, truly inhabits it, not merely using it as a common carrier of its mad disease, the vessel must first die. The flame of frenzy does not share a body. All traces of the original spirit must be melted away before the flame moves in. And thus, even though Midra was fully ripened and capable of becoming the Lord of Frenzied Flame, he needed first to vacate his vessel. He needed first to die. And this brings us to the critical moment in the tragedy of Midra the Sage. He and Nanaya holding each other in grief, accepting at last the cold, bitter truth that their child would never be returned to them, realizing in horror that they had nearly destroyed the world in a hopeless quest to save their family. The couple heroically turned against the god they had put their faith in. If the flame of frenzy needed Midra to die to fulfill its ambitions, then it was this final key that the sage and the lady would deny it. Midra would not take the last step to cement his lordship. He would deny the flame its vessel. Then, the couple heard a commotion in the entry hall below them. The Inquisitors had arrived. The horrible noises of butchery from the lower floor rose to Midra and Nanaya. They knew the tortures that would come for them at the hands of the Inquisition, and Midra urged his lady to flee for her own safety. She kissed her beloved sage one last time, and whispered but a single word to him. A horrible word. A word that promised uncounted centuries of pure, unrelenting pain. and a word that would save the world. The word was endure, and it was a curse. When the Inquisitors thrust the great sword of damnation into Midra, when they left him in the discussion chamber to fester with his thoughts and regrets, Nanaya's word rang in his mind. Endure. Her entreaty surrounded him, supported him, lifted him up when his strength was gone. And yet, it also cursed him. For each moment that he held to Nanaya's wish, to the wish that the world might not be destroyed, the wish that life might continue, was a moment for Midra of the worst possible pain, the worst indignity, living in the knowledge that all his suffering was his own fault, the fault of his hubris and reckless mind, that he had led his household to butchery, that his loyal servants had been tortured to death for his crimes, that he had guided his lady to the very threshold of destruction. And he endured. Heroically, he endured. He endured as each singular moment of suffocating agony seemed a century, and these moments accrued into minutes, and days, and years of absolute torture. He endured as his manse crumbled around him. He endured as the madness welled in his skull, a screaming yellow flame roaring behind his eyes, until all he could see and hear and feel was pain. Unending, intolerable pain. And as for Nanaya, there was nowhere for her to flee. She was trapped. She took shelter in her private study above the library. Her husband's constant screams of agony tormented her. The only comfort she found was in her torch. She cradled it gently in her arms, the unity it once represented still strangely comforting to her, in spite of the fire's revealed horrors. She could hear her child's babbling voice, echoing faintly from the dying flame. She could see her husband hoisting their baby up to Papa's grand bookshelves, so the little tyke could rub a plump finger on the leather-bound tomes. She fell into visions of the three of them, of their family, lying in the green grass, smelling meadow sage on the wind. And so Nanaya drifted peacefully into death. And Midra remained, always remained, and always endured. Part 6. Curing a Curse. Midra endured, at least, until a tarnished enters his manse, and disregards his desperate warnings.
Leave. Now. Come no closer. No closer, I say. The man's wells.
The tarnished breaches Midra's haunted discussion chamber, and the withered, agonized sage cries out in frustration.
The depths of your foolishness!
And attacks, in his half-mad state, hoping to drive away the foolish interloper who fails to comprehend the gravity of the danger. Midra's impossible endurance had allowed him to hold a truth in his heart. And the truth was this. The existence of life was worth something. This belief furiously refused to die, even in the face of his constant agony. Midra endured in the belief that his life was worth living, that the joy he had known made his life worth it, even though he was now consumed by unimaginable suffering. When the tarnished breaks the old man under their weapons, this belief finally shatters, and Midra falls victim to the one fatal thought, the one wish common to all who have hosted the Yellow Fire. that life is not worth living. And Midra, for the first time, truly wished that he had never been born.
Enough. I have endured more than enough. I ask you forgive me, dearest Nanaya.
A truly broken man whose last drop of endurance is spent. Midra resigns to the fire. He rips the barbs from his body, killing himself in a horrifying manner, and finally gives over his well-ripened vessel to the Lord of Frenzied Flame. In the incantation, Midra's Frenzied Flame, we read that Midra, like others before him, was too weak to become a lord. But Midra was not weak. He was the farthest thing from it. In times past, every single person who attempted to control the flame of frenzy succumbed to madness after a desperate internal struggle. Midra was no different in the end. But his struggle was legendary, and his endurance godlike. The tragedy of Sage Midra is this. Driven by an unbearable grief and a desperate desire to save his family, Midra made use of forces beyond his comprehension. When he realized the sheer horror of his error, the depths of its consequences, he tried to turn back from the abyss. But its hooks were too deep in his flesh. There was no escape for him, no hope that his torment would ever end. And yet he held out for an impossible duration, sitting in incomparable agony for years to save the world from the yellow flame. Until finally, a tarnished of no renown arrived, and granted the noble sage his long-denied rest. And Midra, though he will never be remembered, was perhaps the greatest hero the Tarnished had found on their journey.